All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started. It is the top of the hour. My name is Jennifer Morse. I am with MadCap Software. I want to thank all of you for joining today, wherever you are in the world, for our presentation on content strategy best practices with MadCap Flare and Central, also known as MadCap's content experience management platform. And joining me today to review this and all these fun techniques and best practices is Scott DeLoach, founder and CEO of ClickStart, a UA and UX design, consulting, and training company. And over the last 30 years, Scott's given, over 200 presentations, I think, on Flare and Central, embedded user assistance, web-based UI, user interface design, and CSS at various conferences all over the world. He's a Flare instructor, MadCap Doc2Help instructor, consultant, and the manager and leader of our advanced certification program. He's also an author, and he's authored a few really helpful books, which you should check out if you haven't already, including MadCap Flare, the definitive guide, CSS to the point, and HTML5 to the point. So I'm so excited to have you here, Scott. Welcome. Today is a really important chat because a successful content strategy allows folks in the content development space to plan and manage and deliver information that's useful or otherwise valuable to define user groups and various end users. And in this webinar, Scott's going to share best practices for developing a content strategy, planning for consistency and reuse, which is so important, delivering content for specific user groups and end users. We're going to talk about managing teams and content in the Flare and Central platform, and then how do we deliver that content through multiple channels based on that single source of truth, which is what we should all be striving for. So welcome, Scott. I know you have a lot to cover today, so I'm not going to talk any longer. So happy to have you here. But I do want to review two quick items of business before I go ahead and turn over to you. Just as a reminder to everybody, this is going to be recorded, so we will be emailing a link to everybody who's registered. So if you have to drop out early, not to worry, we're going to send you the recording. Also, I want to remind everybody there is a question panel in the GoToWebinar console. Definitely encourage you to ask questions along the way as Scott's presenting. We'll do our best to get to what we can at the end. If we don't get to everything live, we'll be sure to get back to you afterward. We'll put together a question and answer document and send that out to whatever we didn't answer. So please ask questions as you go. We'd love to have you be engaged and keep the conversation started. So again, Scott, thanks so much for joining us today. It's such an important topic. We're happy to have you here, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jen. As Jen mentioned, there is a question area here in GoToWebinar, so feel free to type in questions. Just so everyone knows, I can't really keep an eye on the questions, but feel free to type them in there, even if it's something you think, well, you're not going to have time to cover that. We'll follow up and give you answers to the questions, and we'll have time at the end to talk through them. So even if we don't get to all the questions, if you look, wow, there's a lot of questions, how are we going to get to all those? Or like I said, if you have a really involved question, don't let that stop you from typing in the question panel. I'd love to hear any questions that you have. I see a lot of names in the attendee list that I recognize. It's nice to see everyone again, and those of you that we haven't had a chance to meet, I look forward to meeting you, hopefully at MadWorld. So we can jump into it. I'm going to minimize this here and go over to my presentation. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, so at a real high level, what are we going to talk about? I'd like to talk a little bit about what is content strategy and why it's important, but the bulk of the presentation is going to be some best practices. So we'll talk through the best practices, and as I mentioned at the end, we will have time for questions. Okay, so let's get into it, starting with what is content strategy? So we could define content strategy as planning, management, and delivery of information that's useful or otherwise valuable to defined user groups. And there's a couple of really important words in here I want to focus on because they're going to structure the rest of the presentation. You can see that planning, managing, and delivering information are kind of three core elements of a content strategy. And the whole goal is that whatever you're creating is going to be useful specifically to a defined set of users. Now, probably you have multiple user groups and they all may have different needs and different wants and different goals, and that is part of a content strategy, identifying what those user groups are, especially if there are multiple groups, and what you're going to deliver to help them succeed and ensure that they have a positive experience. Now, why is this important? Why do we care about it? Well, this is an image from the MadCap website. You can go out there and read more about it. But you can see content strategy here. The content strategy, which something we can control, combines with the customer's experience as the content experience. So not only do we want the user or customer, if you want to broaden it out, to be successful in say their task, which is usually what we're specifically focused on in our technical content, but you have to look at the bigger picture. You want the customer as a whole to have a positive experience from beginning to end with the product, not just the small part maybe that we're interacting with them. So how do we do that? That is the role of the content strategy. How do we ensure that the content that we provide gives them a positive experience? If you want to focus more on this bigger picture and the content experience, MadCap has a webinar about that, content experience, what it is and how did we get here. That was presented not that long ago, just a few weeks ago, by my friend Mike Hamilton. So that's a recorded webinar like all the other ones. You can always go back and check out the recorded webinars. So that's out on MadCap's website. I'll also have a direct link to it at the very end of the presentation. What are our best practices? Quite a few. I want to touch on as many things as I can in the time that we have together. I'm going to focus more on, say, what and why type information, but I'm going to weave in as much how information as I can as well. So our best practices, I won't read all those to you, but you can see it follows the same overall guideline I mentioned before, talking about planning, managing, and delivering. Let's start out with developing a content strategy. Ideally, you already have a content strategy in place, but let's be realistic. Probably not. It might be a completely new term to you as we talk about it. You might think, well, it's something I already do. I do all these things. I just haven't thought of them together as a content strategy. But there may be some details in here that are new that you want to incorporate into your overall process. So a big part of the content strategy, starting at the beginning, is to perform what's called a content audit. So let's say you're working on your project. Maybe you've already done this. Maybe you really are just beginning on a project, or maybe you have a project but you've never really stopped to do a content audit. The content audit is going to focus on, we'll work our way out, but let's focus specifically on technical information, the documentation itself. What do you have? Usually when you ask that question, what do we have? You find out that you have a lot of information in the company and it's scattered all over the place. So different people have created information. It's in different systems. Maybe some of it's in SharePoint, some of it's in some kind of knowledge base, some of it is shared with customers, some of it's not, some of it's trapped on people's computers, not even being shared. We want to gather up all the information we have as a company and then analyze it to find out, is this something we should incorporate? Do we want to bring that in and make it part of the official information? And how do we want to manage all that? So content audit is very important because usually you find information you didn't even know existed. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, but a lot of that information is just kind of crud. That's just junk. All right, well, it's still valuable to find it. Maybe you find it and realize, wow, we have some really out-of-date information out here. We've got basically 10 versions of the same thing. So 9 old ones and the current one. Okay, that's going to be valuable from the content audit perspective. If you realize you have 10 copies and 9 of them are out of date and say either they're incomplete or just totally wrong, how about we get rid of them? Because if they're out there, somebody else is probably going to find them and think that that's the version to use and use it. So that's going to be valuable even for stuff that you don't need anymore to sort of clean everything up. So content audit is very important. Maybe you've already done that. Maybe you're thinking right now, yeah, we did that. We gathered up all the technical documentation. We've got it all in one system and there's nothing floating around anymore. That's awesome. But thinking back to the circles I showed you before, part of content strategy, once you feel like you have your part of the world organized, this ties into the last one there, the silos, you need to think of the big picture. What we're focused on with customer experience isn't just the documentation part of it, because remember, the customer is going to interact with marketing materials, possibly training materials, documentation, tech support, and other groups as well. Aligning all of those together. So if you feel like your content is in great shape, expand the circle out to get to that customer experience, because right now you might only be focused on the user experience because that person is at that moment a user, but making sure that your content aligns with, say, what the training materials say, what the sales materials say, the marketing materials. All of that together is going to form the customer experience. Because if you don't do that, the problem is going to be if you stay in these silos, of course, the customer is going to hear one thing from sales, a little bit different from marketing, then they go to training, a little bit different, they look at our documentation, a little bit different, and then they talk to tech support, a little bit different. If those things don't align, that doesn't typically present a positive experience for the user. So start with that content audit of your own stuff that you control, but then eventually you want to do a company-wide content audit to ensure that consistent and unified customer experience. The one in the middle, review and governance schedule. I like to capture that right up front with my content as I'm finishing up the content audit. If typically a content audit is going to be kind of a list of everything that you have with some columns. Maybe one column is where is this and who created it or who's maintaining it, and maybe is it out of date, do we need it, do we need to delete it, whatever. And then one column should be, assuming you're going to keep it, how often should it be reviewed, or when was the last time it was reviewed, so that you can start tracking that. Because a big term you hear in content strategy is governance. Depending on your industry, your content may be required to be reviewed on a set schedule. But even if it's not an external requirement, it should be an internal requirement, always looping back to look at the information to see if it needs to be updated, see if it's still up to date, and maintaining it. So establishing that review and governance schedule. Later on, I'll touch on at least how we can do that in Flare. So I'll show you, we'll switch over to Flare and take a look at it. All right, what about the planning? So we got all our content together, we're ready to roll. We're going to put it all into, let's say, just for discussion purposes, a Flare project. It could be multiple Flare projects. Let's say we're just going to have one. A lot of times, I think we do a pretty good job as technical writers of thinking about reuse. I'm going to touch on those at the end of this list and throw some extra things in there just to give you some ideas. But I think something maybe we could do a little bit better job on is the planning for consistency. So ideally, right up front in a project, or if you don't have one, anytime is a good time to loop back and do it. You really need to have a style guide. And my recommendation for a style guide, and maybe you're thinking, well, we already have a style guide. We're great, just put a little check mark by that one. But a lot of times a style guide is, what I see the most often is a PDF file. So a lot of people have a style guide that's a PDF. Okay, that works, nothing wrong with that. But I'd recommend at least thinking about what the style guide is, why not put it in Flare? That's what I always do. If I can possibly make the style guide in Flare, I do it in Flare. I don't like to have an external style guide. Because if you put the style guide into Flare, say into your project, maybe you make a folder named style guide, it's right there as a reference. It's super convenient. Plus, a big part of the style guide is examples. So just to think of something that's very, very common, in my style guide, I like to have examples of, say, different types of tables that we might use. So I have one in there. This might have dummy text in it, just be blank. but it's already formatted correctly, and it might say, use this table for this, like use this table for troubleshooting, use this table for reference information. The cool thing about having it in Flare is when someone on the team is saying, well, which table style should I use? Which type of table? What should it look like? They can go look it up right there in the project, and if they find it, they can copy it and go where they want to use it and paste it. Can't really do that if it's trapped in a PDF file, but you can do that in Flare. Makes it even more useful. So we definitely want a style guide, not only defining the rules and how we format things, but giving examples that we might be able to reuse. Naming scheme. Naming scheme, to me, you don't have to name things consistently, but it sure is nice when things have a consistent name. And by things, files and folders. Because if you use a consistent naming scheme and you're trying to find something, you already know in your head what its name will be. So you don't have to wonder, oh, maybe it's called this, maybe it's called that, maybe it's over here. You know right away, I was supposed to be in this folder, supposed to have this name. And if you know that you follow the naming scheme, if you don't find it, then that triggers right away, oh, we don't have it. You don't have to wonder, well, maybe it's somewhere else, or maybe I lost it. You can find it. That really adds up from an efficiency standpoint, and it also kind of builds confidence. Maybe you've been using Flare for a while, or maybe you're new to Flare, or maybe there are people on your team that are new to Flare. Let's make people as confident as they can be in the things that we can control. Sure, you have to use Flare a while before you're comfortable with it, just like any other product. That's just how life is. But if I open the project and think, okay, there's some things in here I get. I understand how everything's named. I understand how it's structured. Then I feel a little more confident, and it's not scary to me. I look at projects all the time, and I see projects or things are scattered all over the place and named, and we talk about it like, well, where's this image? And literally the answer is, it's in there somewhere, I think. Well, which one is it? I don't know. All right, that doesn't inspire confidence. That makes me already worried that there's going to be duplicates and things are out of date or things are going to get lost. That does tie into the content architecture, trying to come up with a structure, thinking about in Flare how you've organized the files in the Content Explorer. My best practice, what I'd recommend for the content architecture, is go ahead and think about the user's perspective. So how are you going to organize content to present it to the users? So just to pick a simple example to help everyone imagine it, let's say that we realize, hey, we're going to present the information to the user, and there's going to be these 10 sections of our content. Let's say one of the sections is getting started. Okay, and we've identified some information that needs to be in that getting started section. Well, if that's how we're going to present it to the users, how about on the development side in Flare in the Content Explorer, we have a folder with a name similar to, if not exactly the same as, getting started. In other words, why not organize the content in Flare, ideally, the way you plan on presenting it to the users? Now, you might be thinking in your project, well, we can't really do that because things are organized totally differently for different outputs. Yeah, that happens. I'm not saying you have to do this. But if you know how you're going to organize it for your users, and you can organize it that way in the project itself, in Flare, in the Content Explorer, it's going to make it really easy to find things. Maybe later on someone has a question, like maybe you get some feedback. Hey, I found a typo, and they just say, it was in this in getting started. Okay, well, I know it's at least in these topics in the getting started folder. That helps. The other reason I really, if I can, like to organize my content the way I plan on organizing it in the output is it's kind of like a usability test. Because as I'm working in the project, if I'm having trouble finding content or wondering, well, I'm not sure, is it in this folder or is it in this folder? The user's probably going to have the same problems. If I'm the one working on the content and I have trouble figuring out where the content is stored, I think it's safe to say that someone with less experience of the content is going to have the same problem, if not more problems. Templates. That ties into consistency. So at some point you might realize we have different types of topics. I was picking on reference and troubleshooting before. I use those examples. I'll use those again. So maybe you have troubleshooting topics, reference topics, and let's say procedural topics. And maybe they have a different structure. Let's say your reference topics are pretty much big tables. And maybe your procedure topics, I would expect them to have at least a numbered list in them. If you know they're going to have that same basic structure and you realize you have sort of 3 types of topics just in this example, well, it would probably save time and ensure consistency if we go ahead and make templates of those. So we can have a template for a procedural topic, a template for a reference topic, and a template for a troubleshooting topic. And then when we need to make a new topic, we can base it on that template. Now, something to think about, the best practice would be to go ahead and make the template, but some twists here. You can certainly make a topic template using Flare. But what I usually do, you could try this instead, I usually make a templates folder just like I have a style guides folder, and I put the template topics in there. So they're just topics, sample topics in a folder named templates. When I want to make a new one, I make a copy of one of my template topics and rename it, and then just start adding content rather than making an official template in Flare where you select File, New, and pick the template. I feel like that's a little bit more efficient. There are other advantages that I prefer with doing it that way. So I just wanted to point out there are at least 2 ways to have topic templates. You can make literally a template in Flare terms, or just a sample topic that you're copying and pasting and renaming. Thinking about reuse, switching gears a little bit, I would go ahead right at the beginning of your project, very early, to consider how you're going to take advantage of micro content. Especially if you know you're going to be reusing content in external systems. So you know that you're going to be developing, let's say, a help system, just to pick something. It could be a knowledge base, whatever. But you know that outside of your domain, other people in the company, other systems are going to want to pull content from what you're creating. So you know right away, hey, the training department is going to want to either link into our content or actually reuse some of our content, or we're going to reuse some of our content in the tech support knowledge base or on the website, or ideally, eventually, marketing is going to be reusing it, or sales is going to reuse it. The easiest way to set up that reuse typically is by creating micro content blocks. So there are whole presentations, webinars, certainly about micro content if this is a new topic to you. But think about the micro content way up front, and what I'm shifting towards doing is I focus on micro content blocks and writing those, and then expand out and turn them into topics. So I've adopted more of a micro content authoring process. So rather than writing topics, some of you may remember when we switched from more system, or you might call it book-oriented writing, to topic-based authoring. Well, now what's happening is micro-content-based authoring. So if you're interested in that, we can talk more about that, but I wanted to touch on that as a best practice. Don't necessarily wait till the end of the micro-content of your project to think about micro-content. I would start thinking about it from the very beginning. And then once you have a lot of content, maybe you pulled all this content together that you found scattered all over the place, you brought it into Flare, there's going to be duplication. How do we find that duplication? What's the easiest way to do it? Let's go over to Flare for a second. So here's just a standard project. This happens to be the project that we use in the intro class, so it may be familiar to some of you. So in this project, we'll pretend for a second, I've done the content audit, I've found all this content scattered all over the place in Word and other systems out in SharePoint, I brought it all into Flare, and now I want to find all the duplicated content. The next thing I would do once I have it all in Flare is I would go to the analysis menu up here in the ribbon, suggestions, and there are 4 reports in here that I would run. Snippet suggestions, variable suggestions, frequent segments, and similar segments. And the approach I would take is I would first run frequent segments, because frequent segments is going to find all the duplicated content. So just as this as an example, let's say that we have, let's say, I like to use example, but note. So let's say we have this note, and we realize, wow, we've used the same note 50 times. Frequent segment is going to find it. It'll be listed in the report. Now, there's not 50 of them in here. I'll run the report. It's not going to be very exciting in this project because there's not a lot of duplicated content. It's been cleaned up. But if the note were in here 50 times, it would be listed, and there'd be a column to tell us, wow, it's in there 50 times. And from this report, we could select it and turn it into, in this case, a snippet. So I usually run that first to find, at a small block of content level, the duplicates. Similar is going to find, in my example, maybe you have the note in there 50 times, but you wrote it a little bit differently. So it could find what should be the same that has deviated over time. Once you start creating variables and snippets, that's where snippet suggestions and variable suggestions come in. So these two reports help you find content that has been typed into topics that matches existing variables and snippets. In my scenario at the very beginning, maybe you don't have any variables and snippets, so to find potential ones first, you could run frequent and similar segments. As you start creating more and more variables and snippets, you can run these reports to find the duplicates. So thinking about the note another way, maybe you're working in a topic, let's say this paragraph here, just to pick something. You're working in a topic and you realize, oh, wait a minute, I know I've seen that other places. I'm going to make that a snippet. So you make it a snippet, and you think, well, I don't have to find everywhere I've used it. I just know it's in there somewhere. Then you could run snippet suggestions, and Flare would tell you, hey, I found some places where you typed that same paragraph. And you tell it to find them all, and everywhere you've typed it, use the snippet you've created. All right, switching gears a little bit, thinking about managing a team. So how are we going to coordinate that? Well, that's where we can take advantage of Central and Flare. They can work together. Let's talk about Central first. Okay. So literally the team itself, if in Central, you can manage who's on the team and which projects they have access to. I'll show you that in a second. And once you've set up the team, you can use the tasks and checklists features in Central. So let's go out to Central. This is just a sample project out here. Okay. So here you see the Teams tab. So let's say you have a bunch of projects out here. Just go to projects, doesn't matter. Just be a big list of projects. So you have a new project and you want to assign people to it. That can be done here on the Teams tab. So that's what these little icons are here. Now, what you can do is you can make a group. You can make a group, a team of people. So if you think, well, we've got a whole bunch of people on our team, I don't want to have to find all 10 of them and add all 10 people as individuals to my project so that they can access it, which means we go out in Central, we assign the people to the project, and then they can import or download the project and work with it. If we don't give them access to it, they can't do anything to it. Well, I wouldn't want to have to add 10 people all separately. So if we make a team, put all 10 people in the team, we can associate the team with the project. That's more efficient. It's a little bit easier. The tasks. I think this is a feature in Central that I don't think it gets used as much as it should be. It's really useful. So I think it gets a little overlooked. So let's take a look at it. Give it a second to come up here. So the way that I use tasks is I think of the tasks as, okay, here's what I need to be working on. So you can go out in Central and assign tasks to yourself, basically. So you can see in this example. So this is just an example, this is kind of a demo thing. We have different tasks. These are marked as to do, these are marked as in progress, and these are marked as completed. So using Central, I can kind of manage my work. What I catch myself doing, that's not the most efficient way to do things. I have to kind of stop myself and think, oh, let's do this a little bit more advanced. Rather than writing down notes on a piece of paper, which you're probably going to lose, like, oh yeah, I need to do this. This is really important. And then the next day it's like, oh, what happened to that piece of, I remember I wrote something down, but I don't remember where the piece of paper is. I don't remember what it was, and you get all stressed out. If you type it in here, you can track it. You type it out, I need to do these things. You can even assign a date to it. And then when you actually do it, you can say, oh, I'm working on this, so you can mark as completed. So it just gives it more structure. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use this. Of course you don't have to. If you have some other system you'd rather use, sure. But this is built into Central and you can take advantage of it. Just tracking your own work if you want to, rather than stressing out about losing a piece of paper. Because again, that's my personal example because I do that all the time. So this is my way to avoid that. But another kind of management feature that I think is used pretty often, but I think it could be used a lot more than it is. There's also these checklists. So if we go to checklists here, I just have a sample one. Okay, so you can go in. This is just a sample one. I'll make one in a second. And you can kind of track your work. The cool thing about the checklist, we'll just change it a little bit. So I'm going to mark that as complete. So see how you get these cool graphs. So I'm just randomly checking some of these just so you can see how it updates. They're going from draft to in progress to complete. So I just marked a few. See how you can track everything. It's pretty cool. You can't do that with a piece of paper. You can't get all of this data. And you can make as many of these checklists as you want. You see, I just have this one, but we can make more. And you get to control what's in it. You give it a name. I'm just going to name an example for a second. And you can tell it what you want to track. So a generic list might be totally custom. Like, I'm trying to keep track of this. Like, need to talk to so-and-so about this or whatever. And then a project file list is maybe there are things you have to do to specific files in your project and you want to track that. Like maybe it's need to change X to Y and you want to make project files. So you can mark it that you've done it for different files in the project. So if it's file related, you could use a project files type. But if it's more free form, you could use generic list. And there's even some templates in here. You can make your own templates. So if you think, wow, I use this checklist all the time. Yeah, you make it a template. Then you don't have to recreate it. So these are really great management features sort of lurking in here. Central has so much to offer. I just wanted to touch on at least these two for now because I think they get overlooked from a management perspective. Now, what about Over and Flare itself? Sure. We have a feature called file tags over in Flare that you can use to track information. I'm going to show specific examples of those when we get down a little bit later into managing content. All right, here in the managing content section, I'd like to talk about some best practices for managing your single sourcing, managing collaboration to make sure we're collaborating as much as possible, so making the content do as much work as we can, and then making sure that our own work is more efficient. We don't want two people doing the same thing. No, we want to leverage that and work efficiently. And collaboration, it is not just our own department. We want to avoid those silos. So maybe you realize, I'm over here writing this procedure, and I know the training department's writing pretty much the same thing. And I know the tech support department is over there writing the same thing. So from a company perspective, we're not really collaborating. We have three departments that really could leverage each other's work. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but if I write the procedure, you could at least use that as a starting point, or in some cases, it could literally be shared. So collaborating first, maximizing collaboration within our own group, and then making sure that collaboration is maximized at a company level. So we'll talk through that, and we'll talk more about this review and governance process. So how are we going to manage reviews? How do we know when something needs to be reviewed? How are we going to manage the review itself? I put in governance because usually if it's mandated from outside, usually people use the term governance for that. There's maybe an external group that you have to send the files to, like maybe the FDA or something like that, and they have to give a thumbs up. So we might call that governance. But it's basically somebody saying, yes, that is still valid, is still correct, is still up to date, and it is worth sharing with our customers. All right, single sourcing. Well, there are a lot of single sources features that we can take advantage of. External resources, global project linking. I want to talk about something small that's, to me, is super useful and definitely ties into single sourcing, a feature that gets overlooked in Flare, the auto suggestion, and the link viewer. So let's talk about some big picture items first, the first two, and then we'll talk about some very specific features in Flare to make things more efficient, the last two. So the first two. Well, global project linking, just to pick that one first, I'm picking that one because I would guess if we did a survey, more people are using global project linking than external resource. You might be using them both, but it wouldn't surprise me as I talk about external resources, you might say, I've never really done that, or I'm not even sure what you're talking about right here, whereas global project linking is a little bit more familiar term. So global project linking is the idea of we have multiple Flare projects. And we've realized that we want to reuse content in those projects. So how do we share content between different projects? So that concept of being able to share content between projects, the way we usually set this up, sometimes you have, kind of a less common use case, but the most common use case of sharing files between projects is you have what conceptually is typically called a global project. The global project is just a normal Flare project, and you store all the files that you want to share in the global project. So that's this whole purpose. It's a container for the files that will be shared. You could call it a shared project. Some people call it a parent project, but we usually call this term a global project. Most people even name the project global. You can name it whatever you want. You could call it my cool shared project if you want to, but conceptually it's usually called a global project, and literally it's usually named global, but you're welcome to name it whatever you want. So some best practices here. If you have multiple projects and you want to share content in multiple projects, ideally you would store the shared files in the global project and pull them from the global project into, let's call them the child projects. Rather than having, say, project A, B, and C, and you realize there is some content in project A that you want to use in B and C, and pulling from project A into B and C. Probably the content is in project A initially because that was the first project you created. They're all siblings, they're all equal to each other, but pulling content from a sibling into another sibling makes a mess. If you give them a parent, the global project, and just move the shared content in there, it's going to be way more efficient and it will scale. So that is what we want to do. There are webinars just about global projects, but I wanted to touch on that as a best practice. If you want to share content that is already stored in a Flare project, ideally you would store it in a global project and pull it into all the projects where you want to use it. Now, some specifics of that. When you're pulling the content from another project, so in my example, I'm working in project A, and I realize there are some files that I need. I want to pull them from the global project into project A. This is where we start to leverage things that I previously talked about. A consistent structure and a consistent file naming scheme. if we use a consistent file naming scheme. Now, something that I like to do, my global files, at least at the project level, like the style sheet, is often shared, maybe the skin, maybe some of the other design files, page layout, template page. They typically are stored in the global project. So one thing I like to do is give them a name that reflects that they're global files. So I might give them a G underscore prefix or G hyphen prefix at the beginning of the name. Sometimes I'll write GL or something. But something in the file name itself identifies as the global file. I like to do that because then when I bring it down into, in my example, project A, right away when I see the file name and it starts with G hyphen, let's say, I know it's a global file. I can tell just by looking at the file name. Now it's going to have a little icon, if you've done this before, it has a little chain icon on it. But sometimes it's hard to see or you might not notice it. But it's pretty easy to see the file name. So that's something to think about if you use that consistent naming scheme. The other one is you specify which files you want to bring from the global project. So if they have a consistent naming scheme, like let's say that there are some troubleshooting topics in the global project and I want them in my project. And let's say as part of your naming scheme, you start out the troubleshooting files with TR hyphen, just to make up something. And I think, oh, I want all the troubleshooting topics. Well, I can tell Flare, hey, find all the topics that start with TR hyphen and bring them all over. You can do that with wildcards. That would be TR hyphen star.htm would be all the HTML files that start with TR. So that's a couple of tips for you, pulling files from another project. External resources. External resources would be, what if there are files that are not stored in a Flare project and you want to use them in your project? If you have not been using external resources, what you've probably done is you went and found the file somewhere and made a copy of it and pasted it into your project. Okay, but I mean, you can do that, that will work. The problem with that is, if that file changes, you're going to have to realize that it changed, and you're going to have to go track it down again, and you're going to have to copy it, and you're going to have to paste it back into the project. So from an efficiency standpoint, not the best. From a consistency standpoint, not the best. Instead of doing that, you could add it to your project as an external resource. And just to kind of show you where that's in Flare, because maybe you haven't done it before. It's in the project ribbon, external resources. So in Flare, you would go find it, just to bring it up, wherever it is. And it could be out on the network or in SharePoint. So you go find it. And you add it. And you can add it wherever you want in your project. The advantage of bringing it as external resource is, I didn't really bring one in, but we'll pretend. Let's say I brought in 20 files as external resources rather than copying myself. You can use the synchronize feature. So I'm starting to wonder, hey, has somebody updated those files? I click synchronize, and Flare checks in my example all 20 of them to see if they changed. And if they change, it tells me, I click a button and it re-imports. So from an efficiency standpoint, external resources are way more efficient. This is way faster than you could possibly check 20 files or 2,000 files. If you have that many, then you could do it yourself. And from a consistency standpoint, Flare will tell you right away if the files change and you need to re-import it. Now if you've been using external resources, there are even some cool advanced things you can do with external resources, like pushing your changes back to the other person. So I'll just mention that for now. But usually external resources are one way. Somebody else is the owner, the content is not stored in Flare, I want to have it in my project and make sure I always have the most recent version. So usually I'm always pulling in their changes, but if you're both allowed to change the content, you could bring it in as an external resource, change it, and send your change back to them. It's pretty cool. Auto suggestion and link viewer. So these are little things, but they often get overlooked. Let's take a look at them. Auto suggestion If you created a variable or a snippet, and I believe we have a variable in here, I can use an example. So we have this fake phone number. We'll use that for now. Okay. So if you have auto suggestion turned on and you start typing something that matches a variable or a snippet, in this case, that phone number, Flare tells me. It seems like a little thing, but this is super useful. If you're working on a team, someone on the team has created a variable. You're supposed to be using it. You don't know about it. They didn't tell you. You start typing it, and Flare tells you, and you might realize, oh, wow, we have a variable for that. Cool. And I can insert it. Same thing for a snippet. The other reason I like it is, even if maybe you work by yourself, just from a kind of efficiency standpoint, I don't have to remember the phone number. I don't have to type the phone number. As soon as I start typing it, comes up, I just press enter. Faster. It's like a kind of like a shortcut. Just to show you, double check to make sure that feature is on, and Flare is under File, Options. And in the options, there is an auto suggestion tab. So you want to check both of these checkboxes. You may only have the variable auto suggestion on and not the snippet. So you may have to check both the checkboxes. This is the kind of feature, as I was showing it to you, if you don't have it on, or maybe this is the first time you really thought about it, you might be thinking, that looks annoying. Sure, give it a chance. I thought it'd be annoying too, and now I love it. But you need to get over that hump that it might be annoying, because as I was telling you, you might forget you have a variable or snippet, or certainly if you're on a team, you don't know what your teammates are doing, and they might forget to tell you they did something. This is a way to avoid that. Worst case, if you really don't like it, sure, you can always run the reports and realize, oh, I shouldn't have typed that. I should have used the variable or snippet. So you can always catch them after the fact. And the link viewer. So the link viewer is great whenever you're wondering, am I using this, or where am I using this? So just to show you a feature I think gets overlooked, maybe you're just curious, where are we using this image? You can right click and go to view links, and Flare will tell you pretty quickly, hey, it's used right here on the home page. And in the link viewer, once it comes up with the list, in this case it's telling me it's used in the topic named home, you can double click on it to open it. And this is the image right here, Africa. If you're trying to find, you suspect, let's just go with images, you suspect, I think I have a whole bunch of images I don't use. You don't have to go through every one of them and use a link viewer. There's, of course, a report for that, unused items. So if you're looking at a form in bulk, sure. But if you're looking at a specific file and curious if you use that file or how do I use this file, that's where the link viewer is more efficient. You know, I'm not interested in every file, I'm interested in this one file, and link viewer. So that helps with managing your single sourcing. Collaboration. So for collaboration, what I would recommend is tracking who does what. I like to create a file tag named authors. So file tags, just to show you, would be file new. And the file type would be, of course, file tag. Authors is a common one. There's already a template for it. I usually name it authors. You name whatever you want. And you type in everyone's name. Once you do that, then you can go to files, whatever they are, images, topics, anything. And you can assign an author and the properties. And you can do them in bulk if you want. So I picked several topics as an example, and I could assign them to author one. If you go ahead and create any type of file tag, whether it's author, status, whatever you want, you can create reports. So now I could create an author report to see who's writing what. I can also see that now in the file list. So I really like this from a file list perspective. Maybe I'm kind of new to the team and I'm nervous, like which topics am I supposed to work on? Well, we now have an authors column. So if I'm author one and I sort it, Oh, okay, I'm supposed to work with these topics. Great. I'm going to ignore all the other ones. I'm going to focus on these because they've been assigned to me. Annotations and notes, a notes topic. I love to use annotations even to write notes to myself. So annotations, you may have used them in reviews, and they can certainly be used for reviews. But annotations are just notes in your topics that will not be included in the output, so you don't have to worry about users seeing them. And they're in the review ribbon because, again, they are often used with reviews, but they don't have to just be used with reviews. Just click Insert Annotation. It's kind of like what Acrobat, I believe, calls a note. Just shows up over to the side. Type whatever you want. So I do that all the time. I write all my notes in Flare itself as annotations. And if you add annotations, of course, there is an annotations report to find all of them, so you can track them all down. So from a team perspective, I deleted it, so it's not in there. From a team perspective, I like annotations. Maybe I go to a meeting and they say, hey, the Johannesburg topic is going to change, but I'm not the author of Johannesburg. Or rather than having to find that person and tell them in the hallway, and they're probably going to forget, and I'm going to forget, I would just open up Johannesburg and type it in. Like, hey, I heard Pete said this is going to change. And then the author opens it. Oh, okay. Scott said he was in a meeting and Pete said this topic's going to change. Maybe I need to check with Pete. So that keeps everything all together in Flare. Sometimes you have these blocks of information, whether it's the vacation schedule of the team or we need to change this and all these topics, whatever. I just like to make a notes topic in my project. As a best practice, you can do that. Type in whatever notes that everybody's supposed to know about, and everybody just checks the notes topic to see what's new. I would apply a condition tag to this topic so that you can exclude it and the users will never see it. So that's just an easy way to keep high-level project notes in the topic. I also do that before I archive a topic to write down notes about the project, things I remember. Because if I'm going to come back to the project a year from now, I'm going to type in all those notes while they're fresh in my mind because I might not remember them later on. All right, the review and governance process, just a couple of best practices here. This ties into file tags that we talked about. So to track who the subject matter experts are, reviewers, and approvers, I make file tags for all of those so I can track that information in Flare itself. At a process level, I mentioned you might have a status file tag so that you can track status levels. I do that in Flare. Translation, is something ready for translation? Is it in translation? Has it been translated? Does it need to be updated in translation? Those could be levels in your file tag set. And governance. Typically what I'm tracking is when it has to be reviewed, or kind of flip side, when was the last time it was reviewed? Depending how you're going to use that information, it may be used internally so that you can set up the reviews. You could use a file tag. Sometimes that information needs to appear in the output. A big difference between a file tag and a meta tag, file tags will not be included in the output, say an online output. Meta tags are. They're hidden, but they're still in the file. So if you wanted to have in a topic the classic last modified, rather than typing that in, certainly, I typically use a meta tag, put that information in, and then using JavaScript dynamically add this by pulling it from the meta tag. And I do that because if I put it in the meta tag, then I can run a meta tag report to not only be able to find all those dates so I can track them rather than having to pull them out of all the topics. So I'm getting 2 for 1. I have the reporting feature of the meta tags in Flare, and I have the content visible to the users using JavaScript pulling it from the meta tag. So meta tags do show up as meta information that's hidden behind the scenes in the topic, but that doesn't mean you can't show it if you want to. So that's just something to think about, tracking those dates. All right, and then focusing on delivering. if you need to deliver content for specific groups, in other words, build different targets for different groups, then you could use conditions to track whether the content needs to be included for different user groups, or even create a TOC that only includes the content for a specific user group. So if you have 3 user groups, you could make 3 condition tags so that you can exclude content that you shouldn't see, or you could potentially have 3 different TOCs. How do I pick between the 2 of them? Normally we use condition tags for this to filter out information users don't need to see so it doesn't get included in the output. But you might go with the TOC approach if not only the information is different for different user groups, but it's organized in a completely different way. So if you use a TOC, not only can you specify which information is included, but how it is organized. Condition tags would allow you to use one TOC, assuming the information is organized the same way. It's just a difference of what's included and what's not included. Sometimes, however, you want to create one output and dynamically be able to show and hide content based on the user group. I gave a presentation about this at MadWorld, and in our slide coming up, I'm going to give you a link to that in case you want to check it out with live examples. So to have maybe one target and let's say 3 different user groups and dynamically show and hide content based on the user group, there's lots of ways to do it that are discussed in the presentation. You could use meta tags, style classes, IDs, or attributes, or even condition tags. And just a quick example. So you could ask whether, in this case, basically, you could ask them, hey, are you a salesperson or not? And you can see how it's showing and hiding content. As part of the presentation, it also covers how you can remember that. So once you tell me that you're in a particular group, I don't show it to you again unless you turn it on. So if I say nope, it could stay off until I say I want to see it. So you'll see that link coming up. It can also be done on a system level. So rather than asking the user based on their login, if you know which user group they're in, it could also dynamically filter the information. And that is covered as well with live examples. And if you have questions about those, you can always ask me. Multiple channels. What if you want to have different content, say in print and online, or maybe you're making several online targets with different needs like help, knowledge base, something like that, or a user guide, tech spec, quick reference. To control which information ends up in the different targets, traditionally we use condition tags, as I mentioned, just like with controlling it based on the user group. It could be done with multiple TOCs. Something to definitely think about, as I mentioned from the very beginning, multiple channels may be channels, outputs, uses that we are not creating by ourselves. So think about from the very beginning how other groups inside the company, because we're focused on the customer experience, not just our specific silo, but how can we use this information? Maybe you've identified, wow, this would be really useful in a sales presentation. This would be really useful in the marketing content of the website, or this would be really useful for training or tech support. If you write those micro content blocks, they can be individually accessed or even pulled and reused in other systems. So condition tags and TOCs let us specify what's included in our targets that we create from Flare, but micro content allows us to bundle up small pieces of content in separate files that could be used by other systems very easily. Now, here's the things I promised you. Here are lots of books about content strategy you can check out. There is a LinkedIn group. Mike's presentation is there. The presentation I mentioned, along with 150 other presentations, are all out here on my website. As Jen mentioned at the beginning, you will get the entire presentation with these links, so don't feel like you have to write them down now. And now I can wrap up. I know, Jen, you have other things to mention.
Yeah, just real quick. First of all, thank you. That was so helpful, Scott. Thanks so much. Just a reminder for everybody, we have Mad World coming up this year, October 8th through the 11th. We have 2 ways to join, at home and also in person. And so there is a discount running through the end of February. Again, you're going to get this deck, so this will be clickable, and you'll be able to see the registration discount. We should have the schedule for papers up gosh, in the coming weeks. I think the team is working hard on that and going to be doing that. So we hope to see you there. Fantastic event. Scott will be there presenting. We're right at time. So we have just a couple questions to go over quickly before we wrap. And I know we could answer these quickly, but they're such good ones. I want to repeat it for everybody here. How do you get to those central checklists again? I don't see it in my menu. And it's a great question because it's kind of tricky sometimes because checklists are tied to projects that we've got synced. So the way we get to checklists in Central is first going to the Projects tab. When you select a project, and Scott's going there now, thank you. When you select a particular project that you cloned or synced in Central, because Central has to see the most current version of everything, if you go to any customer, doesn't matter, any project there. Oh,
Yeah, I can't
maybe
get
one,
into
yeah.
all of them. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll get to one. I can actually
That's
open
fine.
this one.
Yeah, if you go to the checklist, so if you go to the project, you'll see it up there on the top. There is a menu, an option there to get to your checklist that you create. And checklist can be tied to specific projects where you can actually track various files within folders, or I think you showed this example, they can be a bit more generic to the project. So like, hey, this is everything we have to do to get a release out the door. You know, no more crossing it off on a sticky note or on your whiteboard or your window. We can actually use the electronic version of that. So that was a great question. Another question came in about using micro content blocks for text that will be reused. When would you advise using micro content versus snippets for content to be reused? Great question.
It's a great question. It's really easy to kind of blur the distinction between micro content and snippets. So each snippet you create in Flare is a separate file in Flare. And you can insert that snippet, as many times as you want. In the output, it becomes part of the topics. It's not a separate file anymore in the output. Micro content is kind of the opposite. The micro content, you can reuse it in topics, but it remains in its own file in the output. So if I write a little block of micro content, sure, I can use it in my topics, but somebody else outside the project can still just use that micro content block by itself. Whereas the snippet, you can't do that. It becomes part of the topics.
Got it. Yes. How do you approach a content audit where you got 100,000 topics, maybe topics and snippets? Where do you even begin? If you were to look at a wall of files, Scott, where would you start if you had that challenge?
Yeah, if you know that you have a whole bunch of files scattered all over the place, usually what people do is they think about that low-hanging fruit or bang for their buck. So maybe what's the most important? So if your company has like 10 products, maybe one of them is the one that's being focused on, maybe some are in maintenance mode. So I'm going to focus on the things I know I'm going to get the biggest bang for the buck out of. If there's one product that's our bread and butter, I'm starting with content about that, and then I'll work my way down to the others. The other one would be based on where it's stored or your perception of how up to date it is. Because a lot of times people say, oh, we used to have this system and now we have this system. Well, I'm going to start with the new system because I suspect most of the content in the old system is out of date. So that's a way to filter it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good approach. And then another great question that came in, for anybody who's curious, what if a couple questions came in about, hey, I don't have Central yet. Can I try this? And the answer is yes. I would be remiss not to mention to everybody, if you're looking at this going, gosh, this is kind of interesting. I don't have this, or how do I test it? I would encourage you to try it in your own environment. Right on MadCap Software's website, you can actually click a button to request a Central trial. And we can get you set up with a trial as soon as today, if that's something that you're interested in. So if you don't have it, and you're interested in tinkering and testing, and if you want us to help you, we certainly can. So if you visit our website, there's a Request Central trial. You can test it completely in your environment for 30 days, including the output analytics, the project management, all those fun things. And so we'd be happy to help you get set up with that. Definitely, we encourage the tinkering, and myself, my team, the MadCap side, happy to help you with that. So great. Well, I want to thank everybody. Scott's information is up there. Feel free to get in touch with him if you have any follow-up questions. And thank you so much, Scott, for running through this. This is a fantastic session. I hope everybody enjoyed it today. And thanks everybody for your fantastic questions and for being so engaged. And we hope to see you on another webinar soon. So thanks so much, Scott. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and day.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.